A train can't climb a steep mountain. The wheels slip, the engine stalls. The whole thing slides backward. But in the 1800s, America needed railroads over the Appalachians, the Rockies, the Sierra Nevada. Mountains that rose thousands of feet in just a few miles. The solution was simple and insane. Instead of going straight up, they went sideways, then reversed, then sideways again, back and forth, zigzagging up the mountain at 2 miles per hour, sometimes with passengers hanging over sheer cliffs. They called them switchback railroads. And for decades, they were the only way a train could cross a mountain. To understand why engineers chose this solution, you first have to understand what a locomotive actually is. It is not a climbing machine, it is a rolling machine. A steam engine pushes pistons that turn wheels. And those wheels grip the rail through friction alone. Steel wheel on steel rail. That friction, that thin contact patch smaller than a silver dollar, is the only thing moving 40 tons of iron and cargo forward. On flat ground, this works beautifully. A locomotive can pull enormous loads at speed because gravity is neutral. The train is not fighting to go up or down. It is simply rolling across the surface of the earth, and the only resistance is the small friction of bearings and the drag of air. But tilt that track even slightly, and everything changes. Now gravity is not neutral. Now gravity is pulling backward on every ton of locomotive and cargo. And that thin contact patch between wheel and rail has to fight not just to move forward, but to prevent the entire train from sliding back down the hill. A railroad grade is measured in percentage. A 1% grade means the track rises 1 foot for every 100 feet of horizontal distance. That does not sound like much. You would barely notice it walking. A 1% grade feels almost flat under your feet, but for a locomotive hauling 20 loaded coal cars, that 1% grade cuts pulling capacity by roughly half. A 2% grade is considered steep for mainline railroads. At 3%, you are in genuinely difficult territory. Trains slow to a crawl. Helper locomotives are often required, additional engines pushing from behind. At 4%, most conventional locomotives of the 1800s simply could not operate. The wheels would spin uselessly on the rails, polishing them to a shine while going nowhere. The train would stall, then begin sliding backward down the mountain, picking up speed until it derailed or crashed into whatever was behind it. Now consider what American railroad builders faced in the 1820s and 1830s. The Allegheny Mountains rise over 2,000 feet from the Pennsylvania lowlands to their summits. Not gradually, over hundreds of miles, but abruptly, in narrow valleys where streams have cut through the ridges. The Front Range of the Rockies climbs more than 5,000 feet from the Great Plains in less than 50 miles. The Sierra Nevada presents a wall nearly 7,000 feet high on its western slope, with grades that would make a mountain goat nervous. If you wanted to cross these mountains with a railroad, you had 3 options. You could find a natural pass low enough to keep grades manageable. These passes existed, but they were rare, and they were often hundreds of miles out of the way. The lowest pass through the Sierra Nevada added weeks to any journey. The gaps through the Alleghenies were narrow and already contested by roads and canals. You could tunnel straight through the mountain, bore a hole in the rock, and lay your track through darkness instead of over summits. This was theoretically elegant. It was also nearly impossible with 1830s technology. The Hoosac Tunnel in Massachusetts, just 4.75 miles long through relatively soft rock, would take 24 years to complete and kill nearly 200 workers. You could not wait that long. The commerce would not wait. The ore would not wait. You needed to move cargo now, this year, this month. Or you could somehow make the train climb. The mathematics of the problem were straightforward, almost elegant in their cruelty. If a locomotive could only handle a 2% grade and you needed to climb 1,500 feet of elevation, you required track at least 75,000 feet long, about 14 miles, but the horizontal distance across that mountain might only be 3 miles. You could not fit 14 miles of track into 3 miles of mountain unless you made the track go somewhere other than straight. And that is exactly what they did. Imagine standing at the base of a mountain in eastern Pennsylvania in 1827. The air smells of pine and coal dust. Above you, the mountain rises in a wall of green forest and gray rock. You see railroad tracks stretching away from you. Climbing the slope at a gentle angle, maybe 2 or 3%, it rises for perhaps half a mile, hugging the mountainside, before reaching a flat platform cut into the slope. The track ends at that platform, but another track begins right beside it, facing the opposite direction, ready to climb the next section of slope. The train pulls onto that platform and stops. The engineer reverses his controls. What was forward is now backward. The locomotive that was pulling is now pushing. The brakemen check their brakes, and the train begins climbing again, this time heading the opposite direction across the mountain face, gaining another few hundred feet of elevation. At the next platform, they reverse again, and again, back and forth, up and up, each leg gaining perhaps 150 to 200 feet of elevation before the next reversal. A mountain that would require a suicidal grade to climb directly could be conquered with manageable grades by stretching the distance traveled. You traded time and distance for elevation. You accepted that the journey would be 5 or 6 times longer than the straight line distance. You accepted that every reversal would take time and risk. This is the switchback railroad. And the first true example in America was not built for passengers or glamour. It was built for the dirtiest, heaviest, most essential cargo imaginable: coal. In 1827, in the Lehigh Valley of eastern Pennsylvania, the Lehigh Coal and Navigation Company completed the Mauch Railway. The town of Mauch, whose name came from a Lenape word meaning bare mountain, sat at the base of a steep ridge. Above the town, in the mountains, lay vast deposits of anthracite coal. This was not the soft bituminous coal of Kentucky and West Virginia. This was hard coal, nearly pure carbon, burning hotter and cleaner than any other fuel available. The coal was worth money in Philadelphia, in New York, in every growing city on the eastern seaboard. The Industrial Revolution was hungry for fuel, and anthracite was the finest fuel available. Foundries needed it. Steamships needed it. Homes needed it for heat that did not fill rooms with smoke. But Philadelphia was at river level, essentially at sea level, and the coal was 2,000 feet up in the mountains. Between the coal and the market stood some of the most rugged terrain in the eastern United States. Getting that coal down the mountain by wagon was slow and expensive. Every pound of coal required horses, men, and roads that washed out with every heavy rain. A wagon might carry a few tons at most. The trip down the mountain took most of a day. The trip back up, empty, took even longer. The cost of transportation ate most of the profit from the coal itself. The Lehigh Coal and Navigation Company needed a faster way. What they built was unlike anything America had seen before. The Mauch Railway was a 9-mile gravity railroad. Loaded coal cars rolled down the mountain on wooden rails topped with iron straps, descending 936 feet over the length of the track. Gravity did the work. No locomotives were needed for the descent. The weight of the coal itself, tons and tons of black rock, provided all the power necessary. But gravity is not gentle. Gravity is relentless. Left unchecked, those loaded coal cars would have accelerated down the mountain until they derailed on the first curve or crashed at the bottom with enough force to kill everyone nearby. So men rode the cars. Brakemen. So their job was to control the speed of the descent. Each brakeman had a wooden lever connected to brake shoes, wooden blocks that could be pressed against the wheels. When the car moved too fast, when the rumble beneath your feet shifted to a higher pitch, and the wind began to tear at your clothes, you pushed that lever with everything you had. The brake shoes bit into the wheels. Friction converted speed into heat. If you did it right, the car slowed to a manageable pace. If you did it wrong, the brake shoes could overheat and catch fire. Or they could wear through entirely, leaving you with nothing but a lever connected to useless stubs of charred wood. And then you were riding a runaway car down a mountain, around curves that assumed you would be traveling at 10 miles per hour, not 40. Men died on the Mauch Railway. The records are incomplete, but the accidents were frequent enough that experienced brakemen were always in demand. The ones who lasted learned to feel the car beneath them, to sense when the wheels were heating too much, to know by sound and vibration exactly how much brake pressure to apply. It was skill earned through terror, and the men who survived took pride in it. At the bottom of the mountain, the coal was loaded onto boats for the trip down the Lehigh River toward Philadelphia. The empty cars, relieved of their tons of cargo, had to be returned to the top for the next load. In the early years, mules hauled the empty cars back up. Teams of animals dragged the wooden cars up a parallel track, gaining back all the elevation they had surrendered to gravity. It worked, but slowly. The mules could not match the speed of gravity. The return trip took far longer than the descent. By the 1840s, the company wanted the empty cars to return faster, so they added steam power and switchbacks. The Mount Pisgah inclined plane was constructed in 1846 to mechanize the uphill journey. A massive stationary steam engine sat at the top of the mountain, connected to a cable that ran down the incline and wrapped around a drum. Empty cars were attached to this cable and hauled up the slope at grades far steeper than any locomotive could climb. But even cable power had limits. The total elevation to recover was too great for a single continuous pull. So the system included switchback sections where cars would be uncoupled from one cable, reversed on a platform, and connected to a different cable for the next stage of the ascent. A second inclined plane was later added at Mount Jefferson. The complete system used a combination of gravity descents, steam-powered inclined planes, and switchback platforms to move coal cars up and down nearly 2,500 feet of total elevation change. If you were a worker on the Mauch Chunk Railway in the 1850s, this is what your day looked like. You arrived before dawn at the loading docks in the coal region above the town. The air was thick with black dust that coated your lungs within minutes and worked its way into every crease of your skin. Your clothes, whatever color they had been when you bought them, were permanently gray-black now. Your hands were calloused and cracked and embedded with coal particles that no amount of washing would ever remove. You helped load anthracite coal into wooden cars, on each car weighing several tons when full. The coal came down chutes from the mine openings above, a roaring river of black rock that raised dust clouds you could see from miles away. The work was brutal on your back, on your arms, on your lungs. Men coughed constantly. The cough never went away. After a few years, it got worse. After a few more years, some men could not work anymore. They sat in chairs outside their boarding houses, struggling to breathe, waiting to die. Once the cars were loaded, you climbed aboard as a brakeman. Your position was on a small platform at the front or rear of the car, exposed to the wind, within arm's reach of your brake lever. You checked the lever, checked the brake shoes, said a quick prayer if you were the praying type. Then they released the brakes on the lead car and gravity took over. The descent took about 30 minutes. You traveled 9 miles, dropping almost 1,000 feet, reaching speeds that felt terrifying, even though they probably never exceeded 15 or 20 miles per hour. The wooden rails clicked and groaned beneath you. The iron straps nailed to their tops sang as the wheels passed over them. The mountain dropped away on your left, a steep slope covered with rocks and trees, and the scattered wreckage of cars that had derailed in years past. If you derailed at speed, you rolled down that mountainside. The car would disintegrate around you. You would be thrown clear if you were lucky, or crushed beneath tons of coal and splintered wood if you were not. The other brakemen would see it happen, would watch you disappear down the slope, and they would keep going because there was nothing else to do. The cars behind you still needed braking. The coal still needed to reach the bottom. At the base, you helped unload the coal, transferring it to canal boats that would carry it toward Philadelphia. Your back screamed from the lifting. Your lungs burned from the dust. Your hands bled from splinters and rough iron edges. Then you climbed into an empty car for the trip back up. The steam engines pulled you up the inclined planes, the cables groaning under the strain. At the switchback platforms, you helped uncouple cars, signal the operators, reconnect everything facing the opposite direction. The process was slow and tedious after the rush of the descent. The trip back up took 2 hours or more. By the time you reached the loading area again, your legs ached from standing on vibrating platforms. Your ears rang from the noise of the steam engines, you were covered in a fresh layer of coal dust, and the dust from this morning had never quite come off. You did this 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, for wages that barely covered food and rent in the company town. And then something unexpected happened. Something that would transform the Mauch Railway from an industrial operation into something unprecedented in American history. People wanted to ride it for fun. By the 1870s, the coal industry around Mauch was beginning its long decline. The easiest seams had been mined out. Competition from other coal fields was increasing. The railway was becoming less profitable as a cargo operation. But tourists had discovered that riding the gravity cars down the mountain was exhilarating. The views were spectacular. Sweeping vistas of the Lehigh Valley that stretched for miles in every direction. The speed was thrilling, faster than anything most people had ever experienced. It was like nothing else available in America. The Lehigh Valley Railroad, which had taken over operations, saw an opportunity. In 1872, they began offering passenger excursions on the old coal railway. For 50 cents, less than the price of a good dinner, you could ride the switchback up the mountain on the steam-powered planes and then race down on gravity cars. The Mauch Switchback Railway became America's first roller coaster. Not a wooden ride at an amusement park, an actual railroad, climbing an actual mountain, carrying passengers who came from Philadelphia and New York specifically for the thrill of the descent. These were people who had never experienced anything faster than a galloping horse. And here they were, hurtling down a mountainside at speeds approaching 65 miles per hour on certain sections, the wind tearing at their clothes, the track curving away beneath them. At its peak, more than 35,000 tourists rode the switchback every year. Hotels sprang up in Mauch specifically to accommodate switchback visitors. Restaurants and souvenir shops lined the main street. The entire economy of the town transformed around this strange repurposing of industrial infrastructure. The trip took about an hour and covered 18 miles round trip, climbing 2,322 feet through the Pennsylvania mountains. Passengers sat in open cars that had been cleaned of coal dust and fitted with benches. They clutched the railings as the cars accelerated on the steeper sections. Women screamed. Men pretended not to be terrified. Children begged to ride again. Contemporary accounts describe it in terms that would later be applied to roller coasters worldwide. The most thrilling experience of my life. Like flying, but faster. I thought I would die, and I did not care. Lamarcus Thompson, a businessman from Ohio, rode the Mauch switchback in the early 1880s and was inspired to create something similar in an urban setting. In 1884, he opened the Gravity Pleasure Switchback Railway at Coney Island in Brooklyn. It was smaller than the Mauch original, only 600 feet of track, but it used the same basic principle, gravity-powered descent with switchback platforms for the return journey. And Thompson's Coney Island ride was not the first amusement ride in America, but it was the first true roller coaster in the modern sense, a tracked vehicle using gravity and engineered hills to provide thrills for paying customers. And Thompson himself credited Mauch as his direct inspiration. Every loop-de-loop, every corkscrew, every stomach-dropping plunge on every roller coaster in the world traces its lineage back to a coal railway in Pennsylvania, back to brakemen controlling loaded cars on mountain descents, back to the first industrial switchbacks. But Mauch was not the most extreme switchback railroad in America. It was not even close. If you want to understand what switchback railroading truly meant, what it demanded of the men who built and operated these lines, you have to go west. You have to go to Colorado. When gold was discovered in the mountains of Colorado in 1858, prospectors swarmed into territory that seemed barely habitable. Mining camps sprang up at elevations that made lowlanders sick just from breathing the air. Leadville sat at 10,152 feet above sea level. Cripple Creek perched at 9,494 feet. Silverton nestled in a valley at 9,318 feet, surrounded by peaks that scraped the sky at 14,000 feet and higher. These were not foothills. These were serious mountains, among the most rugged terrain in North America. Winter temperatures dropped to 30 and 40 below zero. Snowpack could reach 20 feet in sheltered valleys. Avalanches swept down the slopes with a regularity that locals learned to predict but could never fully avoid. Getting ore out of these mines required railroads. Horse-drawn wagons simply could not handle the volume. A successful mine might produce hundreds of tons of ore per day. That ore was worthless until it reached a smelter in Denver or Pueblo or the distant refineries of the eastern seaboard. But building a railroad to a town at 10,000 feet meant climbing 5,000 to 6,000 feet from the plains below. And the mountains were not gentle slopes. They were steep, rocky walls of granite and gneiss, covered with timber so thick you could not see 20 feet ahead. The narrow-gauge railroads of Colorado became masterpieces of switchback engineering, born of desperation and sustained by sheer stubbornness. The Denver, South Park, and Pacific Railroad, the Colorado Central Railroad, the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad. These lines used 3-foot gauge track instead of the standard 4 feet 8.5 inches. Narrow cars could navigate tighter curves, squeeze through narrower canyons, and handle the abrupt switchback reversals that wider cars could not manage. The Georgetown Loop, completed in 1884, became one of the most famous engineering achievements in American railroad history. To climb 638 feet in less than 2 miles of horizontal distance, the railroad required a route that defied common sense. Trains crossed Devil's Gate High Bridge, a spindly structure of timber and iron that hung 95 feet above Clear Creek. They spiraled through curves so tight that the front of the train could look back and see the rear still entering the same turn. They reversed on switchback platforms cut into cliffs. The views were spectacular. The danger was constant. If you were a passenger on the Georgetown Loop, you spent much of the journey looking straight down at rocks and rushing water. The cars tilted on the curves, leaning out over nothing. The bridges swayed perceptibly when loaded trains crossed them. Children pressed their faces to windows in wonder. Adults gripped their armrests and tried not to think about what would happen if the brakes failed. But the Georgetown Loop was relatively tame compared to some of the mining switchbacks deeper in the mountains. The Alpine Tunnel route, also on the Denver, South Park, and Pacific, climbed to 11,523 feet at its summit, making it the highest railroad in North America at the time of its completion. The approach to the tunnel used multiple switchbacks to gain elevation on grades that exceeded 4% in places. Trains crawled upward at walking pace, reversing at platforms where the air was thin enough to make lowland passengers dizzy. Working on these Colorado switchbacks was extraordinarily dangerous. You were building track at elevations where the air contained only 2/3 the oxygen you were used to. Your lungs burned constantly. Simple tasks left you gasping. Some workers developed altitude sickness that never quite went away, a chronic headache and fatigue that became the background noise of existence. Summer construction seasons lasted only 4 or 5 months before snow made work impossible. Everything had to be completed in that narrow window. Blasting, grading, laying ties and rails, building platforms for switchback reversals. You worked 7 days a week, sunrise to sunset, because the mountain did not care about your exhaustion. The ground was rocky beyond imagination. Every foot of roadbed required blasting with black powder and later dynamite. Men drilled holes in granite by hand, swinging heavy hammers onto steel drill bits for hours at a time. When the holes were deep enough, they packed in explosives and lit fuses and ran. Sometimes the fuses burned faster than expected. Sometimes charges failed to detonate and then exploded when someone approached to check them. Sometimes the rock fractured unpredictably and sent slabs crashing down onto the work crews below. The companies kept records of major accidents, but minor injuries went unreported. A broken finger was not worth mentioning. A gash that needed stitching was part of the job. Men worked with bandaged hands and limping gaits because stopping meant not getting paid, and not getting paid meant not eating. Once the lines were operating, the dangers continued in different forms. Switchback reversals at altitude required precise coordination between engineer and brakeman. The engineer had to stop the train exactly at the right point on the platform. Too far, and the locomotive could derail off the end of the track. Not far enough, and the cars behind could not clear the switch points for the next leg. Brakemen had to set handbrakes on every car before the reversal. This meant jumping off while the train was still rolling, running alongside the cars, climbing up to the brake wheels, and spinning them tight before the train stopped. On narrow platforms with 1,000-foot drops on either side, one slip meant death. Then the engineer reversed direction, backing the locomotive against the train. The couplers had to align. Last, the brakemen had to release the handbrakes in sequence. The train had to start moving again without jerking, because a sudden jerk could snap couplers or derail cars on the tight curves. If the brakes failed during a descent, you had a runaway train on a mountain. The engineer would try to slow by throwing the locomotive into reverse, but the weight of a loaded ore train was usually too much. The options were derailment or collision. Either way, men died. Winter operations were a particular nightmare. Snow could block switchback platforms entirely within hours of a storm. Crews with shovels had to clear them by hand, working in winds that dropped wind chills to 50 below zero. Frostbite was so common that experienced workers learned to recognize the stages. First the numbness, then the white patches on skin, then the blackening that meant tissue was dying. Ice on the rails made braking nearly impossible. The same friction that controlled speed became unreliable when a thin layer of ice separated wheel from rail. Switchback platforms became skating rinks. Brakemen threw sand on the tracks from buckets they carried for the purpose, but in heavy frost the sand froze too. Rotary snowplows were eventually developed, massive machines powered by steam engines that chewed through drifts with spinning blades. They could clear mainline track efficiently, pushing snow aside in walls 20 feet high, but they could not operate on the tightest switchbacks. The curves were too sharp, the platforms too narrow. The switchbacks had to be cleared by hand, by men with shovels, in conditions that would close any modern workplace. And then there were the avalanches. The steep slopes above switchback tracks accumulated snow throughout the winter. This snow compacted under its own weight, bonding into slabs that could suddenly release without warning. When an avalanche let go, it swept down the mountain with enough force to derail locomotives and bury entire trains under 30 feet of debris. The avalanche paths were known. The railroad companies could identify exactly which slopes threatened which sections of track. But they could not prevent the slides. They could only try to predict them, and they were often wrong. On March 10, 1884, an avalanche struck a Denver and Rio Grande train near Woodstock, Colorado. The slide came down without warning, a wall of snow and ice and broken timber moving at perhaps 100 miles per hour. The train was swept off the tracks and buried instantly. A brakeman named Thomas Leahy was killed. His body was not recovered for 2 weeks because the snowpack was too deep and unstable to excavate safely. When they finally reached him, he was frozen solid, still in the position he had been in when the snow struck. There were others. So many others. Avalanches took men on the Argentine Central, on the South Park, on the Rio Grande Southern. They took men who were working and men who were traveling and men who were simply standing on platforms waiting for trains that would never arrive. The companies buried their dead. When they could recover the bodies and hired replacements and kept the trains running, because the ore had to move, because the mining towns needed supplies, because the wealth in those mountains was worth more than the lives of working men. Yet, these switchbacks also created communities. The railroad workers lived in camps and towns along the routes, raising families at 10,000 feet, sending children to one-room schools within sight of the peaks. They celebrated holidays with whatever materials the trains brought up. They buried their dead in cemeteries where the ground froze so hard in winter that graves had to wait until spring. Some of them loved it. Contemporary accounts describe men who could not imagine living anywhere else, who had come to crave the thin air and the overwhelming scale of the mountains. They called the lowlands down below with something like contempt, as if the people who lived there were missing the point of existence. For passengers, a journey on one of these switchback lines was an experience that marked them for life. You arrived at the station in Denver or Colorado Springs in the morning. The air was already warm at lower elevations, and you might be wearing summer clothes appropriate for a July day on the plains. A railroad agent sold you a ticket to one of the mining towns, Leadville or Silverton or Ouray. The trip would take most of the day, possibly longer if there were delays. The first few hours were unremarkable. The train climbed gradually through foothills, following stream valleys, gaining elevation so slowly you barely noticed. The landscape changed from prairie grass to pine forest. The air grew cooler by degrees. Towns passed outside your window: Golden, Idaho Springs, Georgetown. Then the switchbacks began. The train slowed dramatically. You were moving at walking pace now, perhaps 4 or 5 miles per hour. The engine labored audibly, black smoke pouring from the stack, the exhaust sharp and rhythmic as the pistons struggled against the grade. The smell of coal smoke and hot metal drifted back through the cars. You came to the first switchback platform. The train lurched to a stop, the couplers banging as each car arrested its momentum in sequence. Outside your window, you could see the mountainside dropping away, hundreds of feet of slope covered with evergreens and the gray bones of trees killed by lightning or beetle. Below you, you could see the track you had just traveled, a thin line scratched across the face of the mountain, looping back towards where you had started. You could see the roof of the station you had passed through an hour ago. It looked impossibly far away, and it was only a few hundred feet lower than where you sat now. Brakemen jumped off the cars and ran forward. Shouts echoed off the canyon walls, instructions and confirmations passing between men who did this every day. You heard the clank of couplings, the hiss of released brakes, the deep chuff as the locomotive backed against the train. Then you were moving again, but backward, climbing the next leg of the zigzag. From your seat, you were now facing the downhill direction. Through the rear window of the car, you could see the locomotive pushing you up the mountain, smoke and steam trailing behind. Through your side window, you could see nothing but air. The track ran along the edge of a cliff. The mountainside cut away to create a ledge barely wide enough for the rails. And the drop was 500 feet straight down into a canyon where a creek ran as a silver thread. The train crept higher, another switchback, another reversal. The process could repeat 6 or 8 times, each reversal taking several minutes as brakemen secured cars and engineers repositioned. At altitude, you noticed changes in your own body. The air felt different, thinner, harder to pull into your lungs. Your ears popped constantly with the pressure changes. If you climbed onto the rear platform of the car for a better view, you might feel dizzy or nauseous. Your heart raced even though you were sitting still. The locals called it mountain sickness. Some passengers were so affected they had to lie down. Others felt only a mild discomfort that passed after a few hours of adjustment. Boas, you would not know which type you were until you experienced it. By late afternoon, you reached your destination. You had traveled perhaps 80 miles by rail, but only 30 miles in a straight line. The rest was all zigzags and loops and switchbacks, the slow mathematics of conquering gravity. That night, you slept in a hotel at 10,000 feet, wrapped in blankets against the cold that seemed to seep from the very walls. You could hear the wind howling down from peaks even higher, 13 and 14,000 feet, where no one lived and nothing grew. Tomorrow, you might visit a mine, or meet with investors, or simply explore the strange town that existed only because men had found silver in these mountains. And you might take the train back down, experiencing the whole process in reverse, or understanding now why the journey took so long and why the men who operated these railroads deserved every penny they earned. For the people who lived in these mountain towns, the Switchback Railroad was not a curiosity or an adventure. It was a lifeline. It was the only way to move heavy machinery for the mines, the only way to bring food and medicine and building materials, the only way to connect to the rest of civilization. When the railroad was blocked by snow or avalanche, the towns were cut off. Prices for basic goods skyrocketed. Men who needed medical care that the local doctor could not provide simply waited, and some of them died waiting. The isolation was total and terrifying, a reminder of how fragile human presence in these mountains truly was. But everyone knew the switchback was not permanent. Everyone knew there was a better way, if only the money and technology could catch up. Tunnels. The engineering required to bore through a mountain was vastly more difficult than building a switchback around it. You needed to drill through solid rock for distances measured in miles. You needed ventilation to keep workers alive in the depths. You needed to remove thousands of tons of spoil, broken rock that had to be hauled out before progress could continue. You needed years, sometimes decades, of continuous work. But tunnels had enormous advantages once completed. They eliminated the grade problem entirely. Instead of climbing over a mountain, you simply went through it at a constant elevation. No switchbacks, no reversals, no brakes failing on steep inclines, no avalanches burying your track. The Hoosac Tunnel in Massachusetts was the first major railroad tunnel in America, a preview of what was possible and a warning of what it would cost. Construction began in 1851. The tunnel was planned as 4.75 miles long, boring through the Hoosac Mountain at an elevation that would allow trains to cross without any switchbacks or significant grades. It seemed straightforward on paper. It was not straightforward in practice. The rock was harder than expected. Drilling progressed at inches per day in some sections. The original budget of $2 million was exhausted within a few years, and the project demanded more, then more again. Workers died in cave-ins when improperly supported sections collapsed. They died in explosions when dynamite detonated prematurely. They died from bad air in the depths, from equipment failures, from simple accidents in a workplace that was essentially a 5-mile-long death trap. The final cost exceeded $20 million, 10 times the original estimate. At least 196 workers died during construction, and that number is almost certainly an undercount. The tunnel was not completed until 1875, 24 years after construction began. But when the Hoosac Tunnel opened, it transformed railroad operations across New England. Trains that had once required hours to cross the mountain range could now pass through in 15 minutes. Schedules became predictable. Operating costs plummeted because you did not need extra locomotives for helper service. Freight capacity increased because trains could be longer and heavier. The lesson was clear. Tunnels were expensive and deadly to build, but the operating savings over decades made them worthwhile. A tunnel cost more upfront, but saved money every single day thereafter. Tunnel technology improved rapidly after the Hoosac experience. Nitroglycerin and dynamite replaced black powder, making blasting faster and more controllable. Pneumatic drills replaced hand drilling, increasing boring speed from feet per day to yards per day. Ventilation systems improved, moving fresh air into the depths through shafts and fans. By the 1880s, railroad companies began replacing their most troublesome switchback routes with tunnels wherever it was economically feasible. The Cascade Tunnel on the Great Northern Railway in Washington State demonstrates the evolution perfectly. The original route over the Cascade Range, completed in 1893, some used a series of switchbacks to climb 2,882 feet to the summit at Stevens Pass. The switchbacks were difficult to operate, required constant maintenance, and were blocked by snow for months every winter. Helper locomotives were needed for every train. Capacity was severely limited. In 1900, a 2.63-mile tunnel was completed, replacing the worst of the switchbacks. Trains could now cross the Cascades without climbing to the exposed summit. Capacity increased. Operating costs decreased. But even this tunnel proved insufficient. Ventilation was poor, and steam locomotives filled the bore with choking smoke that sickened crews. And the western approaches to the tunnel remained exposed to avalanche danger. On March 1, 1910, that danger materialized with catastrophic force. 2 trains, a passenger train and a mail train, were stopped at the Wellington station on the west slope of the Cascades. Heavy snowfall had blocked the tracks both ahead and behind. Rotary snowplows were working to clear the route, but avalanche danger was extreme. The superintendent ordered the trains to stay at Wellington rather than attempt to move through the danger zone. For 6 days, the train sat trapped at the station. Passengers grew restless. Some hiked out on foot, preferring the exhausting walk to continued waiting. Others remained, trusting the railroad to keep them safe. The crews did what they could to maintain comfort, but supplies were running low and tempers were fraying. On the night of March 1st, weather conditions shifted. The temperature rose slightly. Rain began to fall on the snowpack, adding weight and reducing stability. At 1:42 in the morning, a massive avalanche released from the slope above Wellington Station. The wall of snow was perhaps 14 feet deep at its face and moving at tremendous speed. It struck the two trains broadside, sweeping them off the tracks and hurling them down a 150-foot embankment into Tie Creek Canyon. 96 people died. It remains the deadliest avalanche in American history. The investigation that followed found that the railroad had done almost everything possible to protect the passengers. The avalanche was simply too massive, too sudden, too powerful to escape. But the underlying problem was clear. The route itself was inherently dangerous. The switchbacks and high elevation stations placed trains in zones where avalanches could occur without warning. The only real solution was to go through the mountain instead of over it. The Great Northern began construction of a new tunnel almost immediately. The new Cascade Tunnel, completed in 1929, was 7.79 miles long, the longest railroad tunnel in North America. It bypassed not just the old switchbacks, but the dangerous avalanche zones entirely. Trains emerged from both ends at elevations far below the danger. The station at Wellington was abandoned. The name itself was changed to Tie, as if erasing the word could erase the memory of what happened there. The old switchback route became a hiking trail, the roadbed slowly disappearing under young forest. Across America through the early 20th century, tunnels replaced switchbacks wherever traffic volumes justified the cost. The Moffett Tunnel in Colorado, completed in 1928, eliminated switchbacks over Rawlins Pass. The spiral tunnels in British Columbia eliminated switchbacks on the Canadian Pacific route through the Rockies. The economics were straightforward. A tunnel cost more to build than a switchback route, but the operating savings were enormous. Trains ran faster through tunnels. They pulled heavier loads. They operated in conditions that would close a switchback entirely. Over decades of operation, the tunnel paid for itself many times over. By the 1930s, the era of the operating switchback railroad in America was essentially over, but the most famous switchback of all, the Mauch Switchback Railway in Pennsylvania, did not transition to a tunnel. It simply closed. The coal industry that had created the railway had declined steadily through the early 20th century. Anthracite was losing market share to petroleum and natural gas. The mines above Mauch were played out, the easy seams exhausted, the remaining coal too expensive to extract. The tourism business that had kept the line profitable was destroyed by the automobile and the Great Depression. Why take a train to Pennsylvania for a roller coaster ride when you could drive to Coney Island? When you could barely afford food, who had money for frivolous excursions? In 1933, the Lehigh Valley Railroad ceased operations on the switchback route. The last trains ran. The stations closed. The inclined plane engines were shut down for good. The town of Mauch, which had prospered for a century on coal and tourism, entered a long decline. Population dropped year after year. Businesses shuttered. Young people left for cities where jobs existed. The great Victorian hotels that had housed switchback tourists fell into disrepair. And then, in 1954, something strange happened. The town fathers, desperate for any source of attention and revenue, renamed their town Jim Thorpe. Jim Thorpe, the famous Olympic athlete, had died in 1953. His widow was looking for a town willing to build a memorial. Mauch offered, contingent on the name change. It was a marriage of mutual desperation. A dead athlete whose legacy needed a home, and a dead town that needed a new identity. The remains of the old switchback became hiking and biking trails. The track itself was removed for scrap during World War II, but the roadbed remained, a gentle grade cut into the mountainside that now carried tourists on foot instead of in coal cars. If you visit Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania today, you can walk the old switchback route. The trees have grown up around the roadbed, creating a green tunnel through what was once an industrial wasteland. You can stand at the sites where platforms held reversing trains. You can look down into the Lehigh Valley and imagine what it felt like to descend at 65 miles per hour on a wooden car with wooden brakes. The interpretive signs explain the history. This spot was Mount Pisgah Plain. This was where the coal cars loaded. This is where people paid 50 cents for the thrill of their lives. The switchback railroads were a solution to an impossible problem. American engineers faced mountains that could not be climbed by conventional means. They did not have the technology to bore tunnels, not yet, not quickly enough. They did not have time to wait for better solutions. They had to move freight now, this year, this month. So they invented a method that seems almost absurd in hindsight. Instead of fighting gravity directly, they negotiated with it. They traded distance for elevation. They accepted that a train crossing a mountain would spend hours crawling back and forth across the same slopes, reversing direction dozens of times, traveling 5 or 6 times the actual crow flight distance. It was slow, it was dangerous, it was inefficient by any modern standard. But it worked. The men who built these switchbacks deserved to be remembered. They blasted platforms into granite with hand-drilled holes and black powder charges. They laid wooden rails on mountainsides so steep that one slip meant falling hundreds of feet. They worked in conditions that would shut down any modern construction site. They died in rock slides and explosions and simple accidents that no one thought worth recording. The men who operated these switchbacks deserve to be remembered. Brakemen who rode loaded cars down mountain grades, trusting their lives to friction and skill and the strength of wooden brake shoes. Engineers who judged stopping distances on icy platforms by experience alone, knowing that a mistake meant death. Conductors who collected tickets while the car beneath them swayed over cliffs. And the passengers who rode these switchbacks, who trusted their lives to narrow-gauge cars on the edges of precipices, who endured hours of switchback reversals to reach mining camps in the clouds. They were part of this story too. They paid for the privilege of experiencing something that seemed impossible, and they told stories about it for the rest of their lives. If these stories of American engineering and the forgotten workers who built this country resonate with you, hit subscribe. I cover the infrastructure and the men behind it every week. The switchback era lasted less than a century. By the time it ended, tunnels had proven superior in every measurable way. Faster, safer, cheaper to operate over time. The zigzag routes were abandoned or converted to hiking trails. The wooden rails rotted into the forest floor. The steam engines were scrapped for their metal, but the engineering principle remains. Every mountain road that climbs through hairpin turns is a descendant of the switchback railroad. Every scenic overlook on a cliff-edge highway exists because engineers learned to trade distance for elevation, sought to accept a longer journey in exchange for a passable grade. The mountains are still there. The trains mostly go through them now, through tunnels bored with modern equipment, lined with concrete, ventilated by massive fans. The old switchbacks are memories, preserved in hiking trails and historical markers and photographs in museum archives. But the lesson remains. When the direct path is impossible, you find another way. You accept that the journey will be longer. You accept that the work will be harder. You accept that some people will not survive it. And you climb anyway. They did not go through the mountain. They did not go around it. They went up, the hard way, back and forth, zigzag, switchback, because the mountain was there, and the railroad had to cross it. And when you look at what they accomplished with nothing but iron and wood and human muscle and the willingness to die for a paycheck, you realize that the word impossible was never more than a measurement of how badly someone wanted something done. These men wanted it done, and they did it.